Hello, I'm Hickey, and I'm here with another double-shot interview in Wellington at Motu, the Motu Economic and Public Policy Research Operation, with Andrew Coleman, who's an economist here at Motu. And he's written a fantastic paper, I think, and it's here, and you can get it off their website. We'll have a detail underneath this video, called Squeezed In and Squeezed Out: The Effects of Population Aging on the Demand for Housing. I found it fascinating because it looked at the whole area of what happens when a population ages, who owns and lives in houses, and what's happening there. But Andrew, could you start off by explaining what you were trying to find out when you looked to do this paper?
The paper was written to try and understand the consequences of population aging for the housing market, taking into account all the various feedback loops that you get in an economy. So the basic principle is that as people live longer, they live in houses for longer, and this may lead to a change in the demand for houses. In particular, older people, as they live longer, they prefer to live in big houses, the houses that they used to live in when they were 55 and 65. So there's a pronounced tendency around the world for older people to age in place, to live in their neighbourhoods, maybe in the same house as they've always lived. And we wanted to investigate how that tendency would have a feedback loop on much younger people. And so the paper's really developing a logical thought process or a model to try and work out the consequences of population aging.
And what did you find when you ran your model about what might happen to who owns our houses and what happens if you don't change policy to start with?
Well, there's two major effects about longevity. The first is that there's simply more people. So in the next 50 years in New Zealand, we're expecting the population to increase by about 20%. But almost all of that is people who will be over 65. More people probably means more houses. Well, it does mean more houses, and that probably means higher prices. And by existing New Zealand standards, we'd expect a 20% increase in the number of houses to lead to a 20% increase in house prices. So that's the first effect that we'd find. The second thing is that people living older, if we have the current policies, we'd expect the number of people obtaining a pension to approximately double in the next 40 years. And that means more taxes for working age people and longer pensions for retired people.
And so what does that mean for young people?
Well, young people are finding then higher house prices because there are more people, competition from grandma, so to speak, and also lower take-home pay because they're paying higher taxes. So they're sort of getting squeezed out of the housing market. Now, one way they can respond to this is to squeeze in, live in flats or live at home with their parents for longer. And so we'd expect the increasing longevity to lead to a lower home ownership rate amongst young people as longevity increases.
And this model seems to reflect what's happened in the last 5 or so years. Is that correct?
That's correct. I omitted one of the most important aspects of the intergenerational aspects of the housing market, is that young people are far more credit constrained than older people who have already built up an asset base. And consequently, the higher prices and the lower disposable income tends to mean that the banks will lend them less, or banks will lend them a smaller fraction of a house price. And so we'd expect lower home ownership rates amongst young people. And in fact, that has happened over the last 15 years, particularly amongst people under 40. But the model makes several other interesting predictions. One of them is that since older people like to live in bigger houses, most of the new houses that will be built in New Zealand are going to be larger houses because, well, sort of in the old days when old people didn't live so long, which is unfortunate for them, they would die and their house would be rapidly recycled into a younger household with children. And these days, you know, my mum, she still lives in the same house she's been in for 50 years. It's 4 bedrooms, and good on her, I say, but she is denying that house to a younger person. And consequently, younger people who are entering the housing market are having to build much bigger houses. So one of the predictions of the model is that we'll have older people living in bigger houses, and most new houses will be big. And in the last 10 years, both of those factors have happened. So since 1996, the fraction of people over 65 living in 3 or more bedroom houses has increased by 9 percentage points, from roughly 57 or 58% to nearly 68%. So that's been a tremendous shift in 10 years that we can expect to continue. And also, most houses in the last 10 years have been more than 200 square metres. Again, something consistent with the model, but something which hadn't happened in New Zealand before.
And it's interesting that the way our tax system works seems to reinforce this. How does that work, particularly in the way that older people save or invest their money in rental properties? How has that accelerated the trend or changed it?
Well, there's two aspects to this. As we expect longevity to increase, people will be living longer and they may want to save more during their lifetime. The best way to save in New Zealand, because of our tax laws, is to invest in residential property. First, to live in yourself, and then secondly, perhaps as an investment, as an investment as a landlord. The model suggests that the types of housing that people will get will remain roughly the same. There will be more big houses, but people will get into them later and will live in them longer. So that's very much favoured by the tax system, because if you're wanting to save, the best way to save in New Zealand is first to buy your own home. So that's one aspect of it. The second aspect is that we have some laws in New Zealand, or tax laws in New Zealand, which favour residential property. Now, one of the ones that's really not thought about much concerns the way we tax the inflation component of interest. Now, this is quite an arcane topic, but one which was covered.
It's fascinating, though. And you can explain how it actually changes the way the market operates.
Well, it was covered and examined in detail by one of the 20th century's most famous economists, Franco Modigliani. Essentially, if you lend $100 and the interest rate is 7% and inflation is 2%, by the time you get your $107 back, it's only worth $105 in real terms, because inflation has raised the price of everything by 2%. The government doesn't recognise this, however, and so it taxes you on the full 7% of the interest, even though you're only getting real interest of 5%. Because we tax in that manner, there's an incentive for people who are saving money in their middle age, rather than to lend money to other people, because then they pay these excess taxes on the inflation component of interest, but to seek other investments, shares or residential property. And there's a corollary of this law. When you pay a mortgage, when you pay your 7%, 2% of that is actually savings. It's considered as such in the system of national accounts, although it's not recorded like that in New Zealand. And that's because it's reducing the real value of your debt.
So the inflation is sort of eating away the value of the debt.
Exactly. So if you pay $107 interest, you're back to $100 nominal, but that's only worth $98 real, because the inflation has eroded the value of that debt. It takes you fewer hours to pay it off. And so the extra 2% that you've paid is really debt reduction or saving. And it's not often recognised that, you know, on a standard mortgage of, say, $130,000, which is what the standard is in New Zealand, something like $4,000 a year of your mortgage payment is actually savings. Now, the kicker comes in is that if you're a landlord, you're allowed to deduct not only the not only the real component of your interest, but your nominal component of the interest, which is actually saving. And so you get a tax incentive or a tax deduction for the amount that you're saving. Back to square one. You're 45, you're deciding